We'll be going over, thank you. Anyways, welcome to ACM Impact's discussion-based workshop on COVID and tech workers. Just a little bit of an agenda. We'll be going over kind of how, what the impact of the pandemic was on the tech industry and on tech workers, both technical and non-technical workers at tech companies. And then we'll be going over um, different stuff like benefits, how work from home has evolved, tech recruiting, and we do have a special guest, a guest speaker, who I will introduce later, but I'm very excited for. So yeah, without further ado, let's get started. So first, before we get started off, I'm going to give you guys kind of a little timeline to refresh yourselves about what actually happened these past, I guess, 6 or 7 or so months, because time really flies when you're inside. But basically, um, in January 21st was the first case in the US of COVID, of the pandemic. March 10th is around when UCLA actually announced to officially suspend classes. And March 18th was when California issued the first statewide stay-at-home order. So this was the first state that told everyone to stay at home and stay inside and start working from home. And fast forward around 3 months or 2 months, and in May, deaths in the US topped 100,000. And fast forward another 3 months to basically today, where there are 13 million cases in the US, which is double the number that we had since the end of August. So um, when people talk about there being kind of like a second wave, this is definitely it. It's like we are right in the middle of the second wave. And looking at it, it looks like the second wave is kind of significantly larger than the first wave. So it has definitely been a journey. But let's look at how tech companies reacted to the very start of the pandemic, right? So at the very start, at least, it looked like that um, big companies like Google and Facebook, they reacted really quickly. So for example, in early February, Facebook canceled their developer conference, and in early March, they asked their employees to stay at home and work from home. And the same thing happened with Google, where they asked employees to work from home starting from March 9th. And they started kind of stuff like paid sick leave funds for temp staff and vendors, um, contract workers that work for Google with COVID-like symptoms. They also made similar moves on their respective platforms. So Facebook launched a coronavirus information center and then banned ads for masks, wipes, and test kits in this mid-March. And during the similar time period, Google, as you've seen before in your like YouTube videos and your searches, is that they made it so that COVID-related searches and YouTube videos trigger an alert with CDC information. But, right, so um, we've now been in this pandemic for a while, and a lot of companies now have obviously transitioned to work from home. And some companies have actually begun making transition from temporary work from home to permanent work from home ideas. So there have been companies like Shopify, Coinbase, Twitter, Slack, for example, who have decided that the work from home model is like better for them, and they've decided to like transition most or the entirety of their technical workforce to permanent work from home. And although this was initially very well met, I think a Wall Street Journal study in early March found that something to the mark of 63% of tech workers wanted full-time or increased work from home after the pandemic was over. But a Martech Group study in August actually found that work from home employees reported increased stress, negative impact on mental health, and decreased job satisfaction. Another common issue that was brought up with work from home and with remote work specifically is location-based salary, right? So one of the more, I guess, popular publications that happened, well, like that surrounded Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg was the one where he kind of publicized that he expected employees who choose to work from home permanently at Facebook to have salaries adjusted based on location, right? Now, a lot of people brought up some problems with this kind of specific idea. stuff like a breach of contract, like if a company asks you to work from home, is it legal for them to adjust your salary or adjust your benefits based on where you live, as well as pay discrimination, right? So this might not factor specifically in this case, but for example, in a 2018 dispute over pay equality, the pay differences at Canada Post had actually resulted in rural carriers, most of whom are women, being substantially underpaid compared to the majority male urban coworkers. Um, Another issue that other people brought up was the idea of whether or not your personal information, such as where you live, or maybe even sort of like what house you live in, um, how big is your family, like who is in your family, how many family members do you have, and that information being used, quote unquote, against you to determine your salary. And all in all, um, the impact of remote work has been kind of like felt by, I guess, not only tech workers, but also us as students. Fun fact, burnout is actually classified by the World Health Organization as an occupational phenomenon and a hazard. And a UCI and Microsoft study in August found that 48.6% of the respondents, this was a study like about remote workers held recently in August, and they found that 48% of respondents felt stressed or anxious more than half the time. 54% were exercising less than before work from home, and 70% were engaging in work tasks during personal time. So like this is a huge problem, right? When you have work to do, but because you don't have a real barrier between your personal life and your work life, a lot of that kind of mixes in and out, and you've got no choice but to do personal tasks during work time or work tasks during personal time. So now let's talk a little bit about how benefits changed. So from the bright side, I guess I always like to look at the bright side first, is that there were some like, companies and there were some initiatives to give stuff like cash bonuses for work from home setups. Um, Facebook in particular, they gave portal video calling devices for other employees, as well as exceeds expectations performance ratings for the first half, as well as I mentioned before, Google had a paid sick leave fund for employees experiencing COVID symptoms. However, if you look closely at most of these policies, most of them actually only apply to full-time employees and not contract workers. So what exactly are contract workers? So tech companies famously have like a dual class worker system, where technical and product staff are usually full-time workers, whereas campus staff, moderators, and other workers are usually contract or part-time workers. And so just to give a little perspective on this, I believe, going back to a similar example of Facebook, they have around 45,000 full-time workers and an estimated 15,000 paid contractors who are almost entirely employed by third-party firms. So this means around 1/4 of their entire workforce is like not even directly employed by them, but all like contractors and part-time workers employed by third parties. And so although from the start of the pandemic, Facebook and others have committed to paying all their US contractors like a wage that is reflective of the local costs of living, they recently got flack for um, many third-party moderators and third-party contract workers being forced to return to their office. So for example, specifically Facebook content moderators were employed by a third-party contracting firm, Accenture, and I think they were based in Austin, Texas. And they were forced to return to the office on October 12th with no hazard pay and none of the benefits that I described before. And I think soon after, they discovered that someone working in the building had tested positive for COVID and they had to quarantine again. And so this is on top of like the very hard work that moderators have to do, right? So um, actually, I believe that in May, Facebook settled with current and former moderators in a $52 million ruling that concluded that the job had severely negative mental health effects. And like it's been studied that these moderators usually, like many of them develop post-traumatic stress disorder due to what they see on like the content that they see and they have to moderate on the platform. Now, of course, if we're talking about contract workers and a dual class worker system, we're gonna have to talk about Amazon. So in kind of like a contrast between Amazon and other high tech companies, Amazon actually hired around 175,000 additional warehouse and delivery workers during the pandemic. But at the very beginning, around March, warehouse workers were actually prohibited from wearing masks. And while they were given a hazard pay increase, which is $2 per hour, which is on top of their um, minimum wage of $15 an hour. But this was only given for around 2 months before it was cut in early June. And as of October, more than 20,000 Amazon employees have been infected. And um, I believe on November 12th, there was a former Amazon employee who filed a class action lawsuit against the company, alleged that Amazon violated federal civil rights law by firing them and putting thousands of warehouse employees at risk during the pandemic, especially employees of color. And the interesting thing is that this employee was fired after leading a protest outside a fulfillment center in Staten Island. And the reasoning that Amazon gave for firing them was because they were violating quarantine and social distancing rules. So that was kind of like an interesting double standard to have. And now, of course, when we talk about contract workers at Amazon, we also have to talk a little bit about the gig economy. So what is the gig economy? So it's by definition temporary and where an economy where temporary and flexible jobs are commonplace, and companies tend towards hiring independent contractors and freelancers instead of full-time employees. So these are companies are like Lyft, Uber, DoorDash, Postmates, Instacart, and I guess I'll outline some good things, not many, but some good things that they've done during the pandemic. So they did provide hand sanitizer and cleaning supplies to drivers and delivery drivers, as well as relief funds for impacted workers. However, as many of you know, during the pandemic, they um, were able to pass Proposition 22 through the California ballot system. And so basically what Proposition 22 did was it reclassified gig workers. So they exempted companies like Uber and Lyft from classifying their gig workers in California as employees rather than independent contractors. And what this would have done was originally, I believe, like California AB5 would have forced these companies to reclassify their drivers and their gig workers as full-time employees so that they would be um, given the benefits that would be entitled as full-time employees or as part-time employees, such as like a minimum wage, overtime, paid sick leave, and unemployment insurance. And what Prop 22 does is it allows these ride-hail and delivery drivers to be continue to be treated as independent contractors with like some benefit concessions, like a minimum earnings guarantee, but it's like only based on engaged time when a driver is fulfilling a ride or a request, but not the time that they spend waiting for a gig. And so many people find this like move very controversial because of the fact that it was backed by $200 million like investments from these companies, and it's basically the most expensive proposition in California, as well as some of the controversial tactics that they use. Like for example, in August, after a California court ordered Uber and Lyft to reclassify their drivers in the state as employees, they both threatened to shut down in the state, and they were forced to reclassify their workers. And they also like placed ads supporting Prop 22 in their own app, requiring users to confirm that they like read the message before continuing to use the app. If any of you guys tried to use like Uber or Lyft, Postmates during the pandemic. Um, Continuing to talk about benefits, childcare is also super important when people are working from home. That also means that usually schools are closed. So parents and families often have to worry about childcare. A lot of companies have tried offering extra PTO. So companies like Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Salesforce all extended how much leave that they give for like caregivers leave and etc. But as you can see from these quotes, like this is kind of an all-time thing, and oftentimes childcare becomes a full-time job as well. And many people have to continue working like at very late nights after children go to sleep, which is like really, really terrible for mental health and for stress. And especially what's interesting is that usually when people, like a lot of the times when work gets really hectic, people were able to call on their parents or on extended family to help with childcare. But because of the pandemic and social distancing, and worrying about possibly exposing elderly parents, um, that's like no longer an option. So that further exacerbates the situation. And so next, I want to talk a little bit about recovery. And so I want to introduce a little concept called the K-shaped recovery. So the idea is that what a K-shaped recovery is following a recession, different parts of the economy recover at different rates, times, and magnitudes. And so this leads to the graph like diverging. So if there was two different graphs, one for a certain type of industry, another for another type of industry, the recovery would look like roughly a K-shape where these two diverge. And so what's kind of happening here is that during the pandemic, certain industries like technology, retail, and software have recovered, but other industries like travel, entertainment, hospitality, and food services like haven't recovered at all. Um, and so this was like super striking to me in particular because while um, tech workers might have gone off without too much harm, especially due to how easily their work can translate into work from home and into remote work, a lot of different parts of the economy, and especially contract workers and part-time workers who work for the same tech companies but aren't full-time workers or aren't product or tech focused, they are also like much more heavily impacted along the bottom curve of the K. Now, kind of finally, I want to talk a little bit about tech recruiting. So, as you might have seen, there have been a lot of layoffs. The industry that has been kind of the most impacted include like ride sharing, delivery, housing, and startups. So companies like Uber, Airbnb, Lyft, Yelp, GoPro, and others totaled over 10,000 people getting laid off globally. And of course, this is just a very small subset of tech companies. The unemployment numbers, if you check, show like a much bigger and a much kind of darker picture of um, what employment currently looks like in the United States. And even companies that you would expect not to be harmed as much by social distancing and by the pandemic, companies like Google and Microsoft are even like slowing down or freezing hiring for certain roles. And this also translated into internships. Many internships were impacted. A lot of internships opportunities were even canceled due to COVID. So at companies like Yelp, Glassdoor, StubHub, Airbnb, Disney, other companies reduced internship length and compensation. And that's super interesting where usually interns are like a investment for future hiring of the company. And when a company kind of decides to um, either cut their internship programs or reduce length and compensation, um, that is kind of like a warning sign of um, yeah, the industry in general. And lastly, we have virtual hiring. So I'm sure all of you guys are familiar with this. Interviewing has almost all moved online. So this includes stuff like online assessment services like CodeSignal, HackerRank, um, as well as code sharing services like CoderPad, as well as companies that have outsourced the entire technical interviewing process have grown popular. So if you guys have ever experienced a carrot, that's kind of what it is. And all in all, um, or I guess the virtual hiring experience has become a lot less human and a lot more disjointed from, um, I guess, like what it used to be, because like it wasn't that great before, whereas there was a lot of still online assessments and online video calls. Nowadays, it's all online and all through kind of virtual means. So that kind of wraps up my end of the presentation. So before we move on to our guest speaker, we're going to take a quick 5-minute break. We'll be back at 11, sorry, not 11, at 8:30, where we'll hear from our special guest speaker, who's just joined, um, Aileen Lerner. But yeah, we will be back in 5 minutes. So sit tight, take a sip of water, um, and join us back at 8:30.
Hey guys, it's great to be here. Thanks to Evan for inviting me, especially. I know Evan because he used to intern at Interviewing IO, so applause for him. I was kind of, I know I have 20 minutes to spend with you all today, and I was trying to think what the best use of that 20 minutes would be. And what kind of Evan told me is that there's a lot of consternation about hiring in the wake of COVID, how that's changing, how that's going to affect your internships and your post-graduation jobs. So here's what I thought I would do, and you all tell me if this makes sense. I'd like to introduce myself, give a little bit of context about what I know. And then I would just love to open this up for questions. I'm sure you all are very nervous about a lot of things, and my hope is that today I can peel back the curtain a little bit on how companies look at recruiting, especially college recruiting, what stuff works, what stuff doesn't work, and maybe give you some, I don't want to say hacks, but some pro tips for how to thrive in the current chaos. So does that sound like a good plan?
Sounds
By
great.
your abject silence, okay, I will assume that everybody loves this plan. So, a few words about me. As Bill mentioned, I was an engineer for about 5 years. Toward the end of that, I was an eng manager. And then I, by accident, fell into recruiting and never looked back. I ran hiring at a couple of companies. One you've probably heard of is Udacity. So I ran hiring for all of that. And then I started my own recruiting firm, where I was hiring for startups of all sizes. The largest ones were companies like Dropbox and Asana and Quora, many of whom later became Interviewing IO customers. So I've really seen it from all sides of the table. One of the things that I think was most revelatory to me when I started working as a recruiter is just how rigged the system was and how arbitrary a lot of the stuff was. And that's good and bad, because if you play by the rules, sometimes it's stacked against you. But if you know what to do instead of playing by the rules, you can win. One of the examples I'll give is, I think a lot of people of all seniorities, whether they're in college or whether they're much more senior in their careers, really worry about their resume, right? And what it says, and does this look okay? And the fact is that people don't really read them. So I don't know if it's the best use of your time. The nice thing about you all being UCLA students is that UCLA has a good brand, especially for computer science. So you already have a leg up. I wouldn't worry too much about what your resume says, especially in these COVID times. The fact is, if you've gone to a good school, recruiters will look at your resume, and if you haven't, they won't. It's really, really unfair. One of the crazy things we found in Interviewing IO after helping thousands of people find jobs is that about 40% of our hires had previously applied to an employer, had gotten rejected based on their resume, and then sort of snuck in the back door because they were practicing on our platform and got to interview anonymously with companies. So I'm probably more cynical about this space than a lot of the people you might be talking to, but I also hope that that will be helpful to you. Just a few words about Interviewing IO before I open it up for questions. We've been around for about 5 years. We are an interview practice platform and also a hiring platform. One of the cool things about us is that everything's anonymous, and we're really trying to kill the resume. The reason I came to this conclusion and decided resumes should be killed dramatically and with fire is because I saw so many good engineers being overlooked based on how they looked on paper. So that's what we do. And again, I do think the best use of my time here with you is going to be to answer questions, whether it's about COVID, resumes, hiring. The floor is open. Please, I'm at your disposal. Ask me things and I will do my best to answer them. And we can do this in chat or any way that makes sense. Or you can just speak. How do I stop getting ghosted by companies? Okay, this is such a good question. Thank you for asking it. So when you say ghosted, do you mean that you apply and you don't hear back? Or do you mean that you apply, you hear back, and then at some point in the process, either before or after you interview, you stop hearing back?
I mean that I apply and don't hear back.
Got it. So good news, it's not you. Probably nobody. I think one of the tempting things when you don't hear back is to think somebody took a careful look at my application. They looked line by line at everything I've ever done. They quickly dissected everything I've done wrong in my life and all the poor choices I've made up until this very moment, and realized that I am a piece of shit, right? That's a way to think about it. Fortunately, that's not the right way to think about it. Realistically, applying online, and this was always true, by the way, this was true before COVID, and I think it's extra true after COVID. Applying online is like screaming into a black hole. It's true for all seniorities, but it's extra true for interns and new grads. The reason is this: recruiters are busy, and they tend to have very limited time, and they tend to focus that time on very hard to fill roles. So there's a little bit of supply demand going on. At the junior level, very typically, companies tend to have a surplus of applicants. And then as the roles get more and more niche and more senior, there tends to be a shortage. So what ends up happening is that college recruiting gets minimal attention, even if there's a recruiting team. And the roles tend to get filled very quickly, sort of in an arbitrary way. There's a lot of referrals. Maybe some companies tend to favor certain schools over others because they have relationships with them. But the long and the short of it is that probably nobody is reading your resume or your application. So great, we know it's not your fault. Now, what do you actually do? This is what I recommend. And what I recommend is going to be a slog. And it's probably not pleasant, but it works. So I would focus on a few companies that you're interested in, and rather than applying online, and this is especially true now, in the wake of COVID, there are even more juniors that are looking for work. So that supply demand disparity is even more out of whack and even less in your favor. So find a few companies and go on LinkedIn, maybe go on their blog, read some Hacker News, find some engineering managers that work at those companies. LinkedIn, again, is a pretty good way to do that. There are other ways, like maybe you read a blog post at a company that you thought was good. Who wrote that blog post? Do a little bit of digging. Find their email address. Good news, it's pretty easy to do that. It's typically their first name at thecompanydomain.com, or it's first initial last name. So my email is Aileen@interviewing.io. That's typically how these things work. And just send them a nice email. It shouldn't be something that sounds overly professional. You'll find that a lot of engineers have an allergic reaction to emails like that. Don't talk about networking. Don't talk about how, you know, I don't know, what's a bad pattern in these emails. How you're so excited about the opportunity in this vague way. Say something like, hey, I noticed that this company is working on this thing. I either took a class on this, or I read something really cool, or just look, I really want to learn more about what you're doing. Would love to work for you. I know you probably get, and you know, you'd be surprised. Engineering managers do not get a lot of email from candidates because typically everybody's reaching out to recruiters, but recruiters are not incentivized to help you because they don't have trouble getting juniors. So if you reach out to an eng manager and you're earnest and you sound like somebody who cares about things and likes things, you will hear back. It doesn't mean that they're going to hire you, but the odds of you hearing back and actually getting hired, I'd say, are, I don't know, at least an order of magnitude better than if you apply online, and probably more like 2 orders of magnitude. The downside is that writing emails like this takes time. You know, you want to make them thoughtful, you want to make them personal, but the success rate is going to be much higher. So if I were doing this, I would probably set aside an hour or 2 a day if I'm in the midst of my job search, make these lists and reach out to people. I would also not reach out to like VPs of engineering or directors if they're at big companies, because this is beneath their radar. Eng managers, team leads, these are the people that are actually incentivized to care, because they're the ones that would be working with you, and they're the ones that could use an intern or could use a junior hire. The exception is for startups. For startups, and you can find their size typically on Angel List. You can see how many employees they have. You can reach out directly to the founder. I love when I get, so we're a small company, we're about 10 people. I love hearing from prospective interns. It doesn't mean that we always have work for them, but I'll reply to every single one, especially if they say something that isn't like, you know, the next step in my career, software development, life cycle, blah, blah, blah. Like, don't say that. Just be like, hey, I'm interested in what you're doing. Show that you know what the company does, and, you know, show that you are a thinking person that cares about programming, and you will hear back. Founders love hearing, especially at small companies, from students like you. I've talked a lot, so I'm going to stop here. Does that make sense? No problem. I like hearing myself talk. Any other questions? Maybe anecdotes, things that have happened to you, and you're like, why did the universe do this to me? Oh, okay, here we go. Has the recruiting timeline changed due to COVID? Are companies hiring later? It depends. There are a lot of companies. So I'll tell you what we've observed. So when COVID first hit, when the quarantine started, this was, I remember in mid-March, we actually had an engineer starting on that day, and it was probably the worst day that any engineer has ever had in the history of engineer first days. But when COVID first started, what we saw was this huge pullback on hiring, and that was sort of rooted in uncertainty. There are a lot of companies that had no idea what their headcount would look like. Typically, especially at large companies, there's you know, multiple quarters out. You're planning your budget, and you're planning how many people of what seniority level and what titles you want to hire. And as long as the world around you isn't collapsing and is fairly predictable from quarter to quarter, you can make reasonable assumptions about what that headcount will look like. Then COVID happens, and all of a sudden everything is turned on its ear, and companies have no idea, like recruiters themselves didn't even know if they would keep their jobs. And in fact, something like, I hope I didn't make this number up, but I think about a third of recruiters in Silicon Valley got laid off in the wake of COVID. I actually think this is great. I fucking hate recruiters. I'm sorry. I think this is very good for hiring, but what that meant is not only could these teams not make projections about how many engineers they're going to hire, they couldn't even make projections about how many people would be sitting next to them the next day. So it was a very tumultuous time. And for that reason, to circle back to your question, a lot of hiring stuff got pushed off because companies were just like, we have no idea what our budget is. We don't know what we're doing. What we've started to see, because we work with a lot of companies, is hiring coming back. There's also, by the way, a lot of uncertainty about remote work, right? How do we do interviews remotely? How productive are remote people going to be? How productive are junior engineers working remotely who've never done this before going to be? So yes, I think companies are hiring later because of the uncertainty. I think that there's an opportunity here, though. I talked earlier about, you know, if you are entrepreneurial here and you want to hustle a little bit, I think you can actually win. There is smaller companies, smaller to mid-sized companies can react to change much faster than enterprise. I know that a lot of you probably really want to work at Google and Facebook because in your minds, like, I have to get that internship and then I'm going to be set. If I don't get that internship, my life is over, right? That's a way to look at it. I don't think that's necessarily the right way. The fact is that, you know, companies like Google and Facebook are lagging a little bit, and it might take them a while to get back to this normal, predictable cycle. Smaller companies, on the other hand, are much more adaptable. And the fact that work is now remote creates this amazing opportunity for you. Typically, startups, especially of our size, would never, ever hire a remote intern because you can't manage them properly, you can't help them, right? But you know what? Now you have to, because everybody's remote. So if there are yes, it may not be as impressive as a Google or Facebook internship, but kind of everybody's in the same boat. Reach out to some startups and just say, I want to work during the school year. I'm ready to write code now. I don't really know what I'm doing, but I'm down. I have 20 hours a week. I will do copy changes. I will help comment your code better. I will do testing. I will write shitty little scripts. It doesn't matter. This is what I'm going to do. And if you do that, after a month and you do a good job, I promise you, whatever company you're working at is going to trust you to do increasingly more interesting work. So there's this pocket of opportunity here, because now everybody's open to remote work. Everybody needs the help, and small companies are much more reactive and can do hiring, even if they don't know all their headcount, because they never know their headcount. They're like making it up as they go. Very long answer to a short question. I hope that helps. There's one more here. Do you have advice for virtual interviews, especially long-winded virtual on-sites with many back-to-back interviews? Oh, by the way, I'll add one last thing to what I was saying before. If you don't believe me about increased responsibility, you can ask Evan, because by the end he was writing like really, really huge, impactful parts of our code base, and a fully functional, I'd say almost senior level member of the team. So it's true, not making it up. Okay, so virtual interviews. One of the things, go Evan. I think one of the things that's important for virtual interviews is asking ahead of time kind of like what environment you'll be coding in. This is also true for, back when you used to come in, right? Are you gonna bring your own laptop? Do you need to have anything installed? Are you just gonna be using CoderPad during the onsite while somebody sits next to you, or something like CoderPad? So I think squaring those questions away up front is really, really important. If you need to have stuff set up, you shouldn't waste time during the onsite fretting about it. There's also kind of less opportunity to build rapport with the team. And for those of you who are more extroverted and pleasant, this will probably not be awesome, because that will no longer be as much of an advantage as it was. And for those of you who are not pleasant, this is a great thing. But I think that, and you guys tell me if in your experience it's been different. I think that a lot of the things that matter about onsites are unchanged. You have to be really, really solid with coding interviews, and you just have to, grind and do a lot of practice. And regardless of whether you're doing stuff on a whiteboard, one of the things that's nice about junior level interviews is that you're not going to have to draw that much stuff. There's fewer systems designy kinds of questions. If you get them, they're probably going to be pretty fundamental. So just less drawing of trees and more implementing trees. Think about it that way. So this advice is probably stuff you already know, but I would say, especially because you can't lean on being charming as much in some of these settings, make sure that you practice the hell out of your data structures and algorithms and get very, very comfortable. Okay, would you give similar recruiting advice to a first year looking to get their foot in the door for the first time, or are there uniquely suited tips? Similar to first year looking to get their foot in the door. So this is first year, you mean a freshman?
Yep.
Yeah, so it's really hard to be a freshman and get meaningful work. I think you probably know that. The reason is this, historically. So many college students naively think that the reason internships exist is to get cheap or free labor for companies. And that's maybe 20% of it. But the reality is that our expectations tend to be very low for interns. Where, if you produce something of worth, and I shouldn't admit this, but it's kind of true. If you produce something of worth, we're thrilled. The fact is that internships, much more than being a vehicle for getting cheap or free labor, are a way to recruit full-time hires. So if you see companies being very selective about only taking interns who are juniors, right? It's not because they necessarily think juniors are more useful or that you've learned that much more between, between your sophomore and junior year. It's because for every year you are away from graduation, the company is investing in you, but there's like more probability you'll drop off. So if you do an internship after your sophomore year, then you'll probably end up going to Google after your junior year, and it'll be like, well, I dated this guy for years and then he went and married somebody else. It's like kind of like that. So I think that with that in mind, you'll probably have to target companies or opportunities that are less focused on, having this big machine that turns interns into new grad hires. It's probably, as a freshman, going to be very hard for you to break into a FANG level company, not just because it's extra hard right now because of COVID, but because they have a system. And once companies have a system and they don't look at you as a human, then it's kind of hard to make exceptions. Fortunately, there are smaller companies and probably a lot of really good research opportunities on campus as well that you can look at instead. We had an intern, Evan actually started working for us before he started college, but we had another intern who was a freshman and he was doing some stuff. Smaller companies actually really like cheap and free labor because we're poor. So just something to think about. And I think you'll find a lot more bang for your buck if you're thoughtful about which kinds of opportunities you target. Okay, any advice to stay positive and handle internship rejections? Gracefully asking for a friend. So hypothetically speaking, if you are rejected, so we talked a little bit about, hiring is a funnel, right? So there's rejection when you first apply before you speak to a human, right? And that rejection you should not feel bad about because that rejection 99% of the time happened without a human actually like considering your candidacy. So that's literally not personal. If you get rejected after speaking to a human, that stings and it sucks. And once you get rejected a lot, it stings and sucks less. And it starts to feel, you sort of get hardened inside and die a little bit. And then, you're reborn. But, it takes a lot of rejection before you get there. One of the nice things if any of you want to do an adventurous thing one summer, if you can get a sales internship or like a telemarketing thing where you're doing a lot of cold calling, that's a fast-tracked way to learn to deal with rejection. Not necessarily the right thing. I would say that most people, so one of the things that this maybe some data will help. So I mentioned before that Interviewing.io is a platform where people practice technical interviewing and then they also do real interviews. We've hosted close to 100,000 interviews, both real and practice by now. And what we've seen, and this is nuts, and I think this should be encouraging and kind of shows how arbitrary the technical interview process is. Only about 25% of people perform consistently. And that doesn't mean they always perform well. Some people just always perform poorly, and that's okay too. But the remaining 75% are actually all over the place. And a good chunk of people will have a day. So everything on our platform is on a scale of 1 to 4, where 1 is very bad and 4 is very good. So there are a lot of people that just oscillate between 1s and 4s. And there are a lot of cases, this is literally happens, right? So we've at different points in our existence have hired for both Lyft and Uber, sometimes at the same time. And what happens is somebody will mess up not even mess up, somebody does poorly for whatever reason in their Lyft interview. And then they interview with Uber the next day. They do well, they get that job. And the Lyft recruiters are reaching out to them 6 months later, trying to poach them and vice versa. And there's just, the interview process itself is so non-deterministic that I think one of the things that's really important to internalize is that it's a game. It's a numbers game. The sooner you internalize that, the less self-flagellation, for every minute you're beating yourself up, I would say just take the time and practice instead. I'd say that if you're getting a hit rate of, even 40 or 50% in your interviews, you're doing amazing. And that's not just because, like a lot of this is just out of your control. your interviewer might be bad, the question might be bad, you might not hit it off with the interviewer. It could be a question where something has to click in your head and it didn't click. The best way to overcome this, one, is to just be like, okay, it's a game. I'm just going to keep tossing this coin. It's not personal, just going to keep tossing the coin. But the best thing you can do outside of not beating yourself up, and I will keep saying this over and over, is practice. I think my time is actually up. I didn't get final permission from Evan to do this. So Evan, please forgive me if I'm not supposed to do this. But I thought it might be nice, because I know a lot of you are probably like grinding on leak code, and because I believe practice is so important, I thought it could be nice if we did a raffle where we gave, some portion of you a free interview on our platform. So we have peer stuff that's always free, but if you want to interview with somebody from Google or Facebook, you have to pay. But if this is okay with the club, if you sign up here, 5 people will get 1 free interview on Interviewing.io. I know times are tough. And we also have a thing where you can practice now and pay us later. And that's for everybody. You'll see that on our dashboard when you get in. It's been really fun for me to talk to you. I'm going to drop my email here as well. If anybody has any questions.
Sorry, Eileen, I think you are sending a message to me.
Oh,
privately.
I'm sorry. Okay, you are right. I don't know why I did that. Okay. All right, so here's, so sign up by tomorrow morning here, and then we'll give out 5 interviews. And also this is my email. So if anybody has questions, or there's, this hiring sucks and it sucks for now. And I hope I can help a little bit. So look forward to hearing from some portion of you. And thank you all so much for having me tonight.
Thank you, Eileen. Yeah, no, I think your experience is super insightful, and I love your brash but really straightforward answer to the questions. Yeah, really, really enlightening. Thank you so much for coming.
It's my pleasure. Maybe one day you'll have me back. All right, have a great night. Enjoy the rest of your event, everybody. Thank you so much again.
Thank you, Eileen. Have a nice night.
Bye.
Bye-bye. All right. So we'll be taking another short 5-minute break, or 3-minute break, and then at 9 we'll be coming back to do discussions, and we'll break out into breakout rooms, and I will share the discussion questions in a sec. But take another drink of water, internalize what Eileen went over, and yeah, come back for our discussion. Thank you. I'm going to quickly go over our discussion questions, and then we're going to break out into breakout rooms, and I'll have the facilitators kind of pick a question to visit, and I'll switch up the groups halfway through. But without further ado, here come a couple questions I guess I want you guys to internalize. In terms of the future of remote work, to what extent should work that can be done remotely be done remotely? And as an extension of that, how can we circumvent the impacts of a future pandemic? Is it possible to even mitigate the negative effects of remote work? So stuff like work-life balance, stress, mental health issues, and should compensation be calculated for remote workers? Like, how should compensation be calculated for remote workers, and should location be a factor? We also have questions on the dual class worker system. So is this dual class worker system present in many tech companies fair? And do they treat contract workers with dignity? If yes, how well do you think the tech companies handle the pandemic in terms of contract workers? And if no, why not? And how would we fix this? And as like a addendum, do you think this system reflects or exists outside of the tech industry, and in what form? And then finally, we have the future of remote hiring. Do you think the current technical interviewing practices are effective in recruiting a talented and diverse workforce? Are virtual interviews as effective in person or on-site interviews? How can they be improved? And do you think companies should consider canceling or reducing the duration of internships during kind of something like a pandemic here? So finally, here are the discussion questions. I linked to at least a doc of them. And while you find that, I will split you guys up into breakout rooms.